On the northeastern shore of Sicily, on the finger of land that points out to the Aeolian islands, stands the town of Milazzo. With settlements dating back to the Bronze Age, Milazzo is a rich catalogue of peoples who have passed through or made their homes on the island. So often overlooked by the summer visitors boarding hydrofoils for the Aeolians, the town is nevertheless home to an impressive fortified citadel. Here we are at the entrance to the castle of Milazzo, but to call it a castle is actually something of a mistake, because more correctly it is a fortified citadel, because here within its walls it once contained a whole town of people. Rather like eating an artichoke, a visit to the castle is like peeling off the leaves of history to reach the heart. Its construction has been in continuous evolution since at least the ancient Greeks, with Byzantines, Arabs, Normans, Swabians, the Aragonese and the Spanish all contributing to its development. The outlying walls of the castle were begun in the 16th century at a time when Europe was still threatened by the Ottoman advance and Sicily was under constant harassment from the Barbary pirates, brothers Arouj and Khayr al-Din Barbarossa. These are parts of the castle that are off limits nowadays to visitors. They are too dangerous structurally to visit. But we have outlying bastions, again built in the 16th century by the Spanish. And then somewhere down there, and I don't know exactly where, and I've never visited it, but there is an English cemetery. There are the graves of half a dozen or so English people who died not in any battle or anything, but whilst the castle was under the occupation of the English at the beginning of the 19th century. So here we are at the entrance to the castle. This is where the portcullis could have slid down. But in order to get this far, anybody would have to come, as you can see through this tunnel behind me. But look at the hole up above there. Any invader that was going to get this far was going to have boiling oil or tar or water poured down on top of them. Behind me is what is known as the Duomo, if you like, the cathedral of the Citadella of Milazzo. This was designed and built in the beginning of the 17th century by a Florentine architect by the name of Camillo Camilliani. Now, he was better known really as a military architect. He designed castles, defensive walls, and so forth. By coincidence, he was also the architect who designed Piazza Pretoria in Palermo, the so-called Piazza of Shame, the Fountain of Shame. It's that fountain with the naked statues, if you've seen that in Palermo. But this building, the Duomo of Milazzo, is actually unique in Sicily because the beginning of the 17th century was the time of the ascendancy of Baroque architecture here in Sicily. But the Duomo of Milazzo is built more to the style of Renaissance architecture. And that's because Camillo Camilliani was coming from Tuscany, coming from Florence, and he preferred that kind of architecture. But the other unique feature of it is the cupola, or the dome of the cathedral. Think of the Duomo of Firenze, of Florence, and you'll remember how the Duomo is actually perched up high. But here, in the Duomo of Milazzo, it is missing the architectural piece that we call the Tambour. That is like the plinth on which the dome would actually sit. And there's a very good reason for that, because here, being in the middle of a castle, it could have easily been attacked by cannon fire, and it would have meant that cannonballs would have flown over the top of it rather than hit it directly. So here we are at the entrance to the Aragonese part of the castle. This port and walls were built in the 14th century. You can notice the typical rounded turrets of the Aragonese style. And just above the doorway you can see the coat of arms of the Aragonese family, the typical red and white bars of the Aragonese flag. And also notice the portholes above the doorway and in the turrets for firing out cannons and arquebuses and so forth. But there were two other further lines of defence just inside this gateway, and I want to show you those now. Let's go and have a look. So, just inside the entrance here, there are two tunnels like these, and these tunnels lead to nowhere. But any eventual invader coming in through the gate would think perhaps that they led somewhere. They'd go down to a dead end, and then they would be blocked off and massacred. So, if the invader were to breach that gate here, they would come up this slope towards the second gate. But in the meantime, this was another line of defence. You see that chute there? They would have dropped down huge round boulders, or rocks, rather like cannonballs, that would have rolled down this chute, rolled down the slope like marbles, and would have trampled any invader trying to get further into the castle. In the first years of the 20th century, the castle was used as a prison by the fascists. And the garden behind me here was, if you like, the exercise yard for the prisoners. And we can still just about see, if you look on this pillar here, this is the fascist symbol, the fasces, the bundle of sticks and the axe head. Made in concrete, rather worn away now, but still just about visible. This doorway behind me dates from the time of Frederick II, so in other words the beginning of the 13th century. Notice the slightly pointed arch, and in fact the coat of arms above this doorway again is that of the House of Aragon. But really what I want you to notice are these walls, the walls of the keep. Notice that they are square in contrast to the rounded turrets of the Aragonese that we saw earlier on. And notice the corners of them reinforced with the black, strong Lavic stone from Etna. Here we are in the courtyard of the Frederick II part of the castle, so in other words the 13th century, but notice how it has undergone many changes over the course of the years. For example, look at that very fine staircase behind me. That's a Catalan staircase dating from the 16th century. Look also at the windows in the wall over there. Notice that they have got bars on them, because they were the cells of the prison when it was converted to a prison in the 20th century. Notice also behind me the well. There are some very deep wells underneath this castle. The castle could have withstood any kind of siege for quite a matter of months. And also notice in the very far corner, they look like cannonballs, but remember that we saw the chute through which the balls were dropped down. I think they're not cannonballs. I think they were the balls that were dropped down from the chute by the Aragonese. Here we are in what would have been the Great Hall at the time of Frederick II. And we know that Frederick II passed through this part of Sicily several times. Up in the town of Santa Lucia, for example, he had a hunting lodge and a park. The same thing again in a nearby town of Rometa. So it's quite probable that at least on one occasion, the King Frederick II ate in this dining hall. And look at this fabulous fireplace here. You can imagine that this would have been used, it would have been a great spit with an ox or a pig or something like that roasting on the fire, and the smoke going up to the heavens, as it were. But let me also draw your attention to these rather fabulous arches, typical of the time of Frederick II. Here we are in the very heart of the castle, and that behind me there is the Norman keep, dating from the 12th century. Again, notice the black lavic stone that has been used to reinforce the corners. Notice the square construction of it, and notice also the supports at the base of it. And also there's some very nice brickwork up at the top, brickwork decorations. But for sure that keep was built on the top of an earlier castle. We don't have any vestiges of it, we can't see it, but almost certainly there beneath that there would be an Arab tower perhaps, and beneath that almost certainly would have been the Roman castrum, and beneath that the Greek fortress. So here we have, just like as I said, the artichoke, the many layers of the artichoke, but that is the very heart of the artichoke of the Milazzo castle. Here we are inside the dungeon of the keep. Nowadays it's nicely lit up, it's all been nicely cleaned up. As you can imagine, back in the past it would have been a dark and grisly place. Nowadays there's quite a nice exhibition here. This particular plaque is telling us about the Norman king Roger II, who had been the king of Sicily at the time this keep was built. But just while we're here, it's nice to look at, these are some Norman coins. These were ones that were found here in the castle. But look at this. This is what's quite extraordinary, because this, on the one side of the coin, has the face of Christ. We know it's Christ. It says ICXC, the initials of Christ in the Greek language, and on the reverse of the coin is the date in Arabic numerals. Here we are on the top of the Norman keep of the castle, and behind me is the town of Milazzo, and behind that the Peloritani mountains. In the distance, I think you can make out the town on the hillside of Santa Lucia del Mela. And just to the right of that, in the valley, is the valley of the river Mela. Now, therein lies the origin of the name of the town of Milazzo. Many people confuse it because Mela in Italian means apple. It's got nothing to do with apples, in fact, because the name goes back to Greek times. In Greek, the name was Mila, which is the same as Milas in Asia Minor, which is nowadays in Turkey. Mila, in the Greek language, meant quite simply a river that, from time to time, overflowed. So the valley of the river Mela was a river valley that flowed down onto this floodplain behind me, and from time to time, it overflowed. And that is why the soil of the plain of Milazzo is so fertile, and completely explains why, in subsequent years, it became so important for growing, for example, grapevines. Behind me here is what's known as Capo Milazzo, the headland of the Milazzo Peninsula. On a clear day, we can sometimes see the islands. Today it's a little bit misty, but usually there are the 7 Aeolian islands that are in the distance on the horizon there. First one we can see is Vulcano, then behind that Lipari, and on a clear day we can sometimes see even as far as Stromboli. Down here in the bay, nowadays, as you'll notice, there's not very many houses. That's because in the wintertime, this part of Milazzo is exposed to the very fierce west winds, the ponente winds, as we call them. But back in Roman times, that was the site of a Roman tuna fishing factory, one of the earliest ones that we have on the island of Sicily, and archaeologists have unearthed evidence of that factory down there. The most famous episode in the history of Milazzo, certainly in the last 200 years, has to be, without doubt, the Battle of Milazzo. That was a battle between Garibaldi and his soldiers, his 1,000 or 1000 as we call them, and the Bourbons who at that time had the control of this castle. Garibaldi, who had sailed originally from Geneva down to Marsala and had marched across Sicily to arrive here in Milazzo by the 17th of July 1860. Now, the Battle of Milazzo didn't actually take place here in the castle, but rather Garibaldi arrived at a little village called Meri, which is about 10 miles away, 5 miles away, something like that, in the middle distance. And we have it documented that he stayed the night there, and then he climbed up onto the roof of this house so that he could get a view of the territory to see how he was going to attack this castle. Remember, he only had 1,000 men. How on earth was he going to attack this castle? But what he did was he led the Bourbon soldiers out onto the plain below, and most of the Battle of Milazzo actually took place down below us here on the plain. A curiosity is this cannonball fired from the castle by the Bourbons during the Battle of Milazzo in July 1860, and still lodged in the wall of the church of San Francesco da Paola. When the citadel was more or less abandoned after the Second World War, a new mother church was built down in the town, but we can still get an idea of the richness of the interior of the Duomo. Amongst other treasures is this painting by Giovanni Antonio Marchese, a 15th century painter from Messina, which depicts the life of St. Nicholas and held to be a faithful copy of an original by Antonello da Messina that was lost in the earthquake of 1908. So this is a particularly grisly episode, I'm afraid, from the castle of Milazzo. It dates from the time when the castle was an English garrison. This was at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Remember, you'll have heard of Maida Vale in London. Maida Vale was actually a battle in Calabria, and the soldiers set sail for Maida Vale from here in Milazzo. But this cage, as we call it, was found in the 1920s. This is not the original. This is one that it's a copy. The original is now in a museum in Rome. But it was found, as I said, in the 1920s. They didn't know what it pertained to until they found two little buttons next to it from the Enniskillen regiment. We now even have a name of the soldier who was imprisoned inside this cage. His name was James Leonard, and he was from the Enniskillen regiment. We don't know the whole story behind it, but it's quite possible that he was a deserter from the castle. Goodness knows, perhaps he fell in love with a local girl and he ran away with her. He was captured, he was put in this human cage and then hung up and just left to desiccate. One of the great ironies of the castle of Milazzo is that one of the few times it was actually besieged and attacked was by the very people who built it in the first place, the Spanish. So how did that come about? Well, it was, as with everything, a little bit of a complicated chapter in Sicily's history. It was the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 that passed Sicily from the Spanish to the House of Savoy. Subsequently, the House of Savoy swapped it with the Austrians for Sardinia. They didn't really want Sicily. Sicily was too far away. It was much more convenient for them to have Sardinia. So Sicily then became in the possession of the Austrians. And in 1716, 1717, the castle held a garrison of Austrian soldiers. It was at that time the Spanish decided that they'd really quite like to have Sicily back in their possession. And they attacked Sicily, and they attacked the very castle that they built. It was a long siege. It took through the whole of the summer. And in fact, it was due to that the Spanish tore down many of the houses down in the town to build barricades for their cannons in order for them to bombard the castle of Milazzo. What has now become the symbol of Milazzo is this scarab beetle of lavic stone blocks inlaid into the fortifications of the north face. Its significance remains a mystery, but it has been watching over the city for at least 600 years. Nowadays, the castle is open to the public, and for any visitor to the town, it more than repays a few hours' exploration.